Hello to everybody. Welcome everyone, guests from Fabrica, residents from Fabrica, and also the guests abroad. We are really happy to have one of our first online lectures. It's been already our third happening for this co-ecologist program of this new adventures that we're having at Fabrica this year. And today I'm really happy to introduce one of the most interesting artists working today in the forefront of questioning the climate change, cross-species topics, the distribution and extraction of resources, and of course, a wider global economy. His projects are surprising and inspiring visually as they are conceptually stimulating and intricately intellectual suggestive. He has, for instance, reproduced models of glaciers, forests, carbon footprint copies of classic artworks, millenary swamps, extinct urban plants, micrographs, images of artificially produced stem cells. And I hope that today he will introduce you to some of his latest and most fascinating projects. Just to introduce a bit of Michael's work, he has presented and exhibited around the world, especially in the 13th Shanghai Biennale, in the Bienal de Arquitectura Urbanismo in Valparaiso, Chile, at the Swiss Institute in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, Fondazione Prada in Milan, Andrea Rosen Gallery, just to name a few. In 2017, he was recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant. And I wanted to give a wide welcome to Michael and thank him very much for his presence today and being part of this co-ecologist program. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. Thank you, Fabrica, for hosting me. I'm excited to get to talk to all of you. I'm going to share my screen because I have some images. All right, I think I have a title screen up. I'm calling the talk I'm giving today photosynthesism. This is a term or an idea or maybe a movement that I've coined that is an attempt to create a new kind of aesthetic sensibility and set of values that counters what I call fossil fuel modernism. So if in a way we can think of the whole kind of history of the many modernisms as linked to a kind of energy infrastructure and really a kind of fossil fuel energy infrastructure, photosynthesism for me is a way of thinking of a whole new set of artistic ideas and ideals that are in opposition to that whole history. But at the same time kind of borrows from the whole history of isms that defines the many modernisms. So this term, I'll return to it at the end, but it sort of is a kind of lens through which to understand some of the work that I'm presenting. I'm mostly going to talk about fairly recent projects, a few maybe going back at most, I think, 5 years old, but mostly things from the past year or two. All the works kind of touch on kind of metabolic themes and themes of energy, and also the sort of kind of multi-species dimensions to understanding energy as something that's not just created sort of chemically or industrially, but also biologically. So I'm going to start with a series of works that I think kind of get to the heart of some of the kind of engine behind how I think of photosynthesism as not just something that's purely aesthetic and about the way things look and about appearances, but also about sort of driving mechanisms of energy and change. So this was a series in which I was looking at the very origin of photosynthesis and of the ways in which chlorophyll-based life captures energy and stores it in biological matter. So this was a work where I used an existing fountain. I call this work Cyan-C. And I just seeded it with cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria were the very first organisms to use chlorophyll to capture the sun's energy. So they were the first green photosynthetic organisms. And I think what's interesting is before the evolution of these life forms. There really wasn't any biological green on Earth. So I think of this as sort of like the first green. And I wanted to create a kind of living monochrome. So this fountain was a place where these cyanobacteria proliferated and created this green pool. It's also lit from within. That's where you can kind of see that green color being backlit here. But then I wanted to really think about the close connection between photosynthetic processes and organic matter and the whole history of modernity. And so I started by looking at coal. And I think what was so interesting to me about coal is that it was really the driver of industrialization. And yet the way we think of the kind of imagery of modernity focuses on these very artificial materials like steel or glass or concrete. But the kind of organic origins of those materials and of the energy that kind of powered industrialization and modernization was sort of unseen. So I started collecting fossils of the plants that formed coal. Some of these are preserved directly in coal, and some of them are preserved in sediments alongside coal deposits. And I wanted to make these images that to me kind of referenced a high modernist idiom. I was thinking of even like photographers like John Sarkovsky, who is also the head curator of photography at MoMA for decades. He made these photographs of the kind of artificial vegetative details from Louis Sullivan building. So I had a lot of references like that in the back of my mind, but I wanted to take these life forms, these sort of underseen life forms that were at the origin of modernity, and kind of bring them into that kind of modernist vocabulary and imagery. So this is a close-up image of a Myriopteris fern. And these were all plants that lived 300 million years ago. This is an imprint of a lepidodendron, and these were these sort of enormous, they were the size of trees, but they're actually their closest relative today would be club mosses. They're very small things. And yeah, I was sort of going through and finding all of these different kind of amazing forms that somehow had this link to the industrial world. But in my practice, I'm not so much interested in creating kind of traditional representations and creating images, even though I do use a lot of traditional representational media. I make photographs, videos, paintings, drawings, all these things, but they are usually kind of peripheral to these gestures where I try to more directly engage with certain kinds of processes themselves. So here, while I was thinking about these ancient forests for the Carboniferous, and I was thinking about photosynthetic processes, I wanted not just to kind of represent them in another media, but to try to use living material itself as a kind of medium. So this is an installation view where I was trying to recreate a Carboniferous forest. And what I did is I assembled all these plants that are kind of the direct descendants of these ancient flora. So cycads, Oricoria, ferns, and tree ferns. And I brought them into this space of a disused coal gas plant. So I was thinking the site here was very important and kind of a part of the work. Had this idea that at this very location where coal was vaporized and kind of returned to the air, that this would be the place where, with this ancient atmosphere kind of being restored, that these Carboniferous swamplands might return. So I was thinking of this kind of circular logic, and that kind of circular logic is quite important in a lot of my work. I think you'll see that in some other pieces as well. But there was this kind of almost science fiction element of thinking that climate change might, in a sense, kind of restore these ancient forests. It's another image. It was quite a kind of tight space. It was kind of hard to document it in photographs. But I can also show, I have a short video that's a drone moving up through this space that shows this forest sort of in the larger context of the city. And there's something kind of interesting about that work is I think some people saw it almost as a kind of apology for climate change. Like if like climate change will actually allow the sort of emergence of these sort of like beautiful lush forests. And I think there's some element of that. I kind of did want to kind of reveal the sort of unseen kind of like ecosystem that sort of is at the root of fossil fuels. But I think also for me, there's something quite disturbing about this image of this swamp kind of retaking over the earth. And I sort of intentionally showed it as a kind of depeopled earth. So there's something kind of also quite dystopian, I think, about this image. So I think I'm sharing my screen again. This is another work that also deals with sort of the natural foundations of industrial energy sources. But here, instead of thinking directly about fossil fuels, I was looking at hydropower. The work is called 10,000 Li, 100 billion kilowatt hours. The 10,000 Li is sort of the kind of traditionally understood length of the Yangtze River, and 100 billion kilowatt hours at the annual energy production of the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, which is actually the largest power plant on Earth. On the left here is just an image of the glaciers that are at the origin of the Yangtze River. And the image on the right is the Three Gorges Dam, so this enormous hydropower plant on the river. This was the work that I installed in Shanghai. So Shanghai geographically is at the very end of the Yangtze River. It's right where the river empties into the sea. And I wanted at this place to kind of bring back the image of the origin of the river. So these glaciers are the very distant origin of the Yangtze. This site was very important to me because Shanghai, not only is it situated at the end of the river, but it also gets its drinking water from the river. And it also gets a lot of its energy, not just from the Three Gorges Dam, but there are a number of dams on the Yangtze River. So Shanghai was this place that was tied to the Yangtze River in many different ways, through energy, through water, and through geography. So the work was, to me, a way of trying to bring together these different threads. And again, not just kind of representationally, but trying to really work with those processes. So essentially, it's a big refrigerator, but it's powered from the Shanghai grid. So it's being powered by the Three Gorges Dam and the other hydropower plants on the Yangtze. And then it's basically a refrigerator with sprayers. And these misters and these sprayers are releasing Yangtze water through the Shanghai tap. So it's sort of a way of bringing these pieces of Shanghai infrastructure together to almost so that the river creates this facsimile of its origin in subtropical Shanghai. So it's kind of a machine that sort of links into the city's infrastructure. These are some images sort of inside the unit. The unit itself was sort of these modular reusable refrigeration components. So the idea was it more really was made out of water and energy. So really just made out of these pieces of Shanghai infrastructure, the energy from the grid and the water from the tap. This is just a short video that kind of shows the machine at work and kind of shows it in its urban context. So this was another piece where that image of sort of return or of kind of completing a circle or like the snake eating its own tail was very much in my mind. So here the river at its very terminus is sort of connecting back to its origin. This was a work from a couple of years ago called Extinct in New York. I have a series of works where I've looked at both kind of global extinctions in nature, and their persistence in captivity or cultivation, and also regional extinctions in nature. So this was a version where I was really focused on the urban ecology of New York, and its 300-year kind of recorded history. I focused on plants, algae, and lichen to kind of reconstruct the kind of past plant life of New York City, and then compare it with its current plant life. And I focused on those kind of species that were considered indigenous to New York, that have been recorded in New York City in the past 300 years, but which are no longer being recorded in the city, so which are considered extinct in New York. I worked with the Botanical Garden in New York to do this, and kind of joined them in going through their herbarium archives to kind of determine this changing history. We located the very last specimens for a species that had been collected in New York, or what became New York, and to kind of determine these kind of constitute the last observations, the last kind of scientific observations of the species in New York. I took these last herbarium specimens and I actually made these watercolors. So this is a representation of water shield, Brassinia schreiberi is the Latin name, which was last collected in New York in the 19th century. So it had become this very kind of degraded specimen. So I made these watercolors based on the actual last plant, but only representing the kind of botanical matter. I kind of removed all the labels and the tape and the other things that were part of these records. But then after doing that, every record also includes the location where it was collected. And it could have been 200 years ago, it could have been 20 years ago. I went to those locations and documented how they appear to get today. So this is it's called Silver Lake in Staten Island. So that's where that plant was collected, though it no longer appears there today. And in some cases, a lot of these things persisted in areas that are parks or in some way appear more natural, but often they're all kinds of invisible changes that have kind of changed the landscape, and so that these species are no longer occurring there. This is something called the swamp sunflower, Helianthus angustifolius. And it was labeled as last being collected in New York Avenue in Brooklyn. So I went to New York Avenue in Brooklyn. There are no swamps there today, but made this documentation of that location. This is something called eelgrass. And around New York, there used to be sort of vast eelgrass meadows, but it requires a kind of gravelly ocean surface to attach its roots. And when they opened the big aqueducts in New York City, New York used to be a place without a lot of fresh water, but the aqueducts brought all of this fresh water to the city, and it meant that much more urban waste was being let out into the harbor, and that completely changed the water quality of the water surrounding New York City, and it made it much more full of kind of organic matter. And so instead of there being this gravelly surface that the eelgrass requires, it now has a kind of thick layer of this organic black muck. And so this species is no longer found. It's much, you have to go much farther out from New York City to find it again. But in the 19th century, it was last recorded in Jamaica Bay. And so this is a view to Jamaica Bay. There were about 45 of these species that I cultivated in my studio in my garden that's just outside the city. I had a temporary exhibition where I brought them indoors for about 6 weeks. In order to bring them inside, I also had to create these environments that would sustain them for this period of time. So I often use greenhouses like a kind of vitrine. So they're both sort of these technologies of display, but they're also can help me maintain the right humidity. By adding lights, maintain the right light, add ventilation. So they become kind of like these life support systems for these living things. So I have to kind of modify the exhibition space so that it can support living things, because it's not kind of set up for living things to persist for very long in these environments. So there's all these sort of technological, almost kind of infrastructural modifications that I have to make. So I saw this as kind of like a kind of homecoming for these species. It's like, in a way, the gesture was one of return, of coming back to the city where they've been kind of displaced over decades or hundreds of years. But I also saw it as this kind of very ambivalent kind of homecoming. I wanted to foreground the kind of the energy expenditure and the kind of this intensely artificial and like kind of interventions that were required in order to bring them back. So it's not this sort of easy and just purely kind of joyful, redemptive homecoming. It's sort of this homecoming on life support, with the kind of this requirement of kind of constant care, the sort of need for constant human care is sort of part of the kind of necessary requirement of this return. And in part that has to do with the fact that, you know, this isn't really a home for these species anymore. The landscape has changed so much that a lot of these species just really can't survive in New York without a lot of sort of like additional kind of like modifications. The species in the front here are mostly bog species, and basically all of the bogs in New York have been drained, or the chemistry has changed through all kinds of reasons. Like, for example, concrete really changes the pH in soils, and acidic soils become much more basic. So there are many kind of reasons why some of these environments are just kind of really lost in New York. Other aquatic species, again, the change in the water chemistry around the city has meant that many of the large algae that used to grow in New York Harbor also haven't been seen for just as long as the eelgrass. It's really been since the 19th century. Just some close-up images of the species in the installation. After the end of this temporary exhibition, it was important to me to kind of complete this gesture of return. So I was able to work with green spaces in New York, mostly downtown, to kind of distribute these plants into different green spaces in New York. So they don't exist in any kind of like one particular area, but they've sort of just kind of dispersed into existing green spaces in the city now. I think the one exception was the bog plants. We actually had to construct a small bog on Governor's Island as part of an experimental garden there to accept those species. So the kind of life of an exhibition, you know, especially if it's temporary, it's sort of very important to me, especially when working with living things. But I think no matter what the material is, to think about that afterlife too. So just because the theme of this is photosynthesism, I was going to show some other works where I've sort of used plants as a kind of medium for sometimes exploring issues that kind of go beyond kind of plant life itself. I mean, I think in Extinct in New York as well, that to me, it very much, I was focused on this kind of like vegetal history of the city, but that's also on some level a kind of lens to understand these processes of colonization, of industrialization, of capital that are all kind of tied up with the kind of changing ecology of the city, and plants became the lens to understand those changes. In this work, Contagion Garden, this was something I worked on kind of during the peak of the pandemic. I was looking for a way to represent viral infection, or to see viral infection. And as I've been saying, I often want to work with things themselves, not just kind of representing them. So I wanted to figure out how I can make a work that used an actual virus. And I was looking at the history of even the discovery of viruses. And viruses actually first identified in plants before they were identified in animals. And one of the most kind of interesting appearances of viruses, and it wasn't understood to be a virus until the 1930s, but the most valuable tulips during the Dutch tulip mania were those that were infected with a virus that caused the flowers to, they call it break. They developed these sort of stripes and different patterns. And it turns out those are symptoms of viral infection. But at the time, they were seen as these kind of uniquely beautiful flowers that no one knew where they came from. And that made them very valuable. So I started looking at this history, and actually started growing some of these kind of historic varieties of tulips. So this is an old variety of tulip that's not infected, and it has a sort of solid color. But this is the same variety of tulip with a viral infection. And it's now, but as these florist tulip specialists call it, it's broken into these different kinds of striped or flamed patterns. And what happens is the virus kind of selectively bleaches some of these cells, but also causes the pigments to kind of condense in some areas. So it creates these really interesting patterns. This is an uninfected variety of historic tulip, and then the same kind with the infection. So I think what was so interesting to me is that in a way, these signs of infections also kind of have an art historical value. These kinds of tulips were often represented in paintings of the time because they were very valuable and because they kind of aesthetically looked so different. So suddenly this was a way where a virus made itself very visible, but not just visible, but it kind of took on this kind of aesthetic almost baggage. It was something that we know so well, but don't necessarily associate with viral infection. And this is, there are actually a whole set of terminology for these kinds of tulips and their colorations. Those that have this kind of brownish and yellow color, when they break, they're called bizarres. The ones I showed that were purple, when they break, they're called biblomen. But it's just, there's been kind of hundreds of years of the development of these different terminologies for these flower types. So after kind of experimenting and growing these both infected and uninfected tulips, I had an installation where I was very interested in how infection follows laws of sort of probability and chance. And I was thinking also about kind of modern artistic legacies of sort of using chance as an operation in the creation of an artwork. So here in the work that I called Contagion Garden, I used kind of a completely random system of organizing the flowers. The bulbs themselves, the infected or uninfected bulbs, look exactly the same. So I just kind of mixed together infected and uninfected bulbs and planted them in this kind of simple circle form. And it's not until they bloom where you're able to see which ones are infected and which ones not. I'm kind of continuing to grow these bulbs. This has been a couple of years, so they bloom one more time, and I'm curious to see what happens in the third year to kind of actually trace how the infection spreads. Lake Tai, these are, this was a show that I had last fall. And here I was not always working with living materials, but I was interested in how even dead organic matter could somehow play a role in kind of living systems. Lake Tai is the name of a very large freshwater lake that's just west of Shanghai. This exhibition space is in Shanghai. And what's so interesting about the history of Lake Tai is it kind of became a kind of environmental kind of cautionary tale in the 1990s. Like a lot of freshwater lakes near urban areas, it's developed these algal blooms that were actually quite toxic, starting in the 1990s and through the 2000s, where the entire surface of the lake would become coated in toxic cyanobacteria. And this was because of industrial runoff, urban runoff. It completely changed the water chemistry of the lake. More recently, there have been really large-scale attempts to remediate this lake, which also has a really long kind of artistic and kind of landscape heritage. It's the area where some of the most famous Chinese gardens are. And it's also the area where the most famous garden stones in China come from. They're actually called Lake Tai stones. These works kind of take on the form of these very well-known kind of twisted limestone formations from this lake, but instead of being made from limestone, I've remade them in these organic waste materials from the lake. So I was thinking about how a sculpture as something even very static and inert could somehow play a role in these living systems. So these stoned, actually, I see them as sort of sequestering organic waste sort of outside the chemical cycles of the lake. The darker stones in back, these are actually made from that toxic algae. And there are actually large-scale operations removing this algae from the lake. So I actually worked with them to kind of acquire this material. And some of the lighter stones in front are made from invasive plant species that are actively being removed from the lake. So I see them as sort of sequestering this excess carbon, this excess nitrogen in the form of sculptures that kind of reference the kind of artistic legacy of that region. There were kind of a series of works where I was thinking through kind of very traditional landscape and garden art forms, which in their most traditional sense usually try to convey a very harmonious relationship between humans and nature. Sort of one of the rules of practices like traditional Chinese flower arrangement or garden design, but I wanted to kind of update these to reflect the kind of changed ecology of this region where these practices evolved. So these are all works made in a local clay called Yixing clay that was often used to create vessels for things like flower arrangement. But here I just used that clay to reform and recast litter that I found along the lake. And then I combined these with certain kind of organic elements, like there's a London plain tree leaf, which is a non-native species that's widely planted in the area on the right. I think of these sort of an updated flower arrangements. Or this is a version, this was a Yixing clay cast in the form of a tire I found along the lake, but containing a colony of Lake Tai algae.
Sorry, I have a question. What is the name of this project?
I called the whole project Lake Tai, T-A-I, which is the name of the lake.
At the lake, okay. Like,
yeah.
Okay.
But then these are all individual works within that series. So I think this one I've called Taihu crab. Crab is sort of one of the most well-known products from this lake, kind of traditionally. And they're actually harvested in the autumn in the thousands. There was a period where the crab harvests were suspended because of the toxicity of the water. They've begun now to re-harvest these crab. But here, this kind of harvest of crab, these are also again cast in the Lake Tai cyanobacteria. It's interesting. When it's alive, it's quite kind of blue-green, but when it's dried, it becomes this almost kind of brown-black with a little bit of a kind of greenish tinge to it still. This work still had a very kind of algae smell because it was several thousand of these crab forms. And it's inside a kind of traditional fishing boat. And I was also looking at the cycles, not just of natural waste, but also of kind of artificial waste. These works take the form of the Chinese fir, which was traditionally used to kind of manage the waterways that connect Lake Tai to Shanghai. It's all kind of part of one water system, the two places. And they were actually used to line the creek that connects the two places called Suzhou Creek. But in more modern times, that whole area has become a district of warehouses and factories. In fact, the very place I was exhibiting was a former mansion owned by an industrialist from the Lake Tai region who was running businesses between the lake and Shanghai. So it was also kind of tied up in the very kind of particulars of this exhibition space. But those warehouse buildings along the creek are now being torn down. It's sort of there's a post-industrial period setting in that area. And these works are actually made from recycled concrete from those demolished buildings and salvage rebar from those demolished buildings. So kind of taking those sites of demolition and kind of reforming these sort of ghosts of the history of that area with those materials. And then a last work from that exhibition, this was in the garden of the space where I wanted to actually recreate a fragment of the swamplands that extended from this lake all the way to Shanghai. And the very location in Shanghai, the Jing'an neighborhood used to be swampland, even in historical memory. It had been drained. So here I'm imagining that drained swampland actually kind of pushes its way up and out of this kind of formal back garden and kind of returns temporarily to the city. And so I was able to reintroduce all these plants that would have been native to Shanghai into this garden. And I worked with a an ethnobotanist who had been doing research into the kind of the ancient sites in the vicinity of Shanghai. And she actually had pollen records going back 7,000 years so that we could look at what plants would have been in that region 7,000 years ago. So all the plants included here were those from her records. Here are some close-ups of the plants, things like Zizania, the wild rice, Phragmites, this prickly water lily. And then I think there's time. I'm just going to talk about, this is a project from earlier this year. It's quite different, called Mirror Moon. And here I was thinking about, so I think many of my works seek to understand sites or processes, living entities that were once formerly considered purely natural, that have now in some way come under the sway of the human. And this work, I think, kind of encapsulates that. I was thinking about the unseen side of the moon, so it's called the far side of the moon. So we're very familiar with like the man on the moon. We always see the same face of the moon through all of its phases. But there's another side that's always unseen from Earth. This is also the site where a lot of sort of recent moon exploration has been focused. So some of the most recent expeditions have focused on landing on this far side of the moon. I even just saw a few days ago that there's a new mission that's being launched to bring back samples from the far side of the moon. And part of the reason for this is there's a lot of speculation about possibilities of moon extraction and moon mining. One of the reasons for that is there's sort of this speculative technology that would use helium-3 from the far side of the moon as a kind of super fuel for fusion reactors. It's not something that's been realized, but I think there's still this sort of eagerness by many countries that could explore moon mining, that this could be the future, and so there's a lot of investment there. I think what was so strange to me is thinking about how this completely unknown landscape, this kind of this whole side of the moon that's unknown, it has been unknown for almost all of human history, is now already being seen as a potential place for exploitation and extraction. So I wanted to at least kind of like bring this unknown image into our everyday rhythms and experience. And so this was a projection piece that represented a kind of simulation of that backside of the moon. And it ran in sync with an actual lunar cycle. So it ran for 29 days, which is a complete lunar cycle. But kind of every night as the moon would rise, it would show the flip side of the moon, that backside of the moon that we don't see. So the phases of this backside of the moon were always kind of the exact opposite of the phases of the moon we saw in the sky. So this is just running through some of those. This backside, the far side of the moon, also looks quite different. It's much blanker. It doesn't have that familiar face. And then I'm going to share, I think I have a few more minutes. I'll share one last project. This is very much kind of an ongoing work. I've sort of shown one iteration of this, but I kind of hope to create others, called The Purple Earth. This is more of a kind of speculative project. I'm borrowing the name from a kind of scientific theory that is quite speculative called the Purple Earth theory. This theory envisions that before the emergence of green photosynthesis, so before that very first slide I showed, the sort of emergence of cyanobacteria, that there were likely other kind of phototrophic organisms that use the sun's energy to drive metabolic processes, but that they would have used a more kind of simple mode of capturing light energy that use something called retinol, which is a purple pigment instead of chlorophyll, which is a green pigment. And so this theory states that the oceans would have been covered in these purple organisms before the Earth turned green. And to me, what's interesting about this theory is it sort of suggests a kind of ways of thinking about the planet itself as something very alien, and also a way of thinking about the kind of almost the sense of sort of the infinite possibility for envisioning other ways of living, other kind of life forms, other ways of producing energy that go beyond what's known. And so I was actually kind of using this kind of living process as a kind of jumping off point for more kind of speculative or sort of science fiction ways of sort of thinking about other possible futures that are inspired by kind of possible pasts. So the central element here is actually a bioreactor that supports organisms that still use this purple pigment, that still use retinol to drive phototrophic processes. It's something called halobacteria or haloarchaea, and they are probably related to some of these very, very ancient organisms. Over the course of the exhibition, it became more pink, more purple. This is at the very beginning when it had just been seeded. And then around this sort of light fixture, I created something which I'm calling the Purple Earth Reading Room. And this is sort of a growing collection of texts that kind of tap into this idea of sort of speculative imagining, of sort of imagining other worlds that are very different from the ones we know, and are sort of structurally very different from the ones that we know. So some of these are scientific texts, some of these are science fiction, some of these are kind of memoirs of exploration, all kinds of texts that I think could sort of expand on and kind of keep kind of like almost proliferating the speculative possibilities that this one theory kind of like almost propels my thinking into. But yeah, this is sort of an ongoing, this is sort of the beginning of this process. These are some of these texts. I created this sort of purple reading space for this collection of texts. And then I'll just end. This is what I'm calling the Manifesto of Photosynthesism. So this idea of this new ism felt important to me because I felt like it was kind of time to have to kind of declare a new way of working and a new set of values and a new kind of direction for artistic practice, kind of borrowing from those kind of big breaks in the manifestos of these early avant-gardes. But at the same time, I also wanted to kind of directly counter a lot of what I see those kind of early avant-garde movements standing for. So this manifesto, it borrows in many ways the kind of the structure, even language from early avant-garde manifestos, and specifically the Futurist manifesto. And for me, the Futurists who celebrated the expenditure of energy, who celebrated speed and fires and really all the kind of technological trappings of industrialization and also the violence behind that. This document tries to kind of turn that on its head and to see the photosynthesis and this sort of capture of energy and the sort of also the exuberance of vegetative life as a kind of aesthetic and kind of process-based model that always has run completely counter to those ideals of especially the futurists, but many other modern movements as well. So I'm not going to read this here. I can share a PDF if you're interested. I also have it posted on my website. But I see this as sort of one way of sort of like kind of declaring a new age, and especially what that means for artists. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, amazing work. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Michael. There were so many layers. I think now it's time for questions, and I would like to start asking you your point of view, like if you think it's possible to create a dialogue by technology and other species and other non-living materials where we don't have to necessarily prioritize one of them, but where they are preserved through a collaboration, like of a mutual support, and have so the chance to coexist equally, not just in the art world, but in our everyday life.
Yeah, so I think, so much of my practice is about sort of exploring that intersection of nature and technology. And it's, to me, these are very complicated questions that don't have easy and sort of singular answers. So one of the things, I think some of the projects I showed early on, like the Drowned World, I think there I want to show that technology and nature have always been connected. we just don't always look at it. So the entire, the whole kind of infrastructure of fossil fuels is rooted in living things, even though it's having this impact that is kind of very destructive to many other living things, but that these processes are always plugged into each other and linked up and really just so entangled as to become inseparable. So part of my work is just trying to make those connections more visible. Also, I think so we can be more attentive to those relationships between things like technology and nature. At the same time, I also am not just looking at sort of what exists, but sometimes trying to propose new relationships. So for example, in the Extinct in New York work, there I kind of want to show how this kind of investment in kind of technological infrastructure, like those greenhouses equipped with lights and these sorts of things, could also be extended to actually create these some kind of affordance of care to other living things that maybe whose care had been overlooked through the kind of industrial and technological development of New York previously. So kind of looking at the sort of the very different kind of ends to which nature and technology might be combined, while also kind of drawing out and looking at how those have already been kind of completely enmeshed with the one with the other, sometimes very destructively and sometimes not.
So are there some questions from the public? You guys of the residency can take over. Turning on your microphone.
Am I audible, Mikey? I hope I am. Okay,
yeah,
perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so cool looking through your work. But when you were sort of talking about this, this sort of feature of your work that you keep landing on with this idea of like a closed loop, and I think there are elements of that even in like the Dark Side of the Moon project, where there is that closed loop coming. My question's about maybe like the ideation phase about it. Like now that you have maybe coincidentally sort of like arrived at the sort of feature of your work, now when you're sort of trying to actually fabricate a project, are you trying to get back to that place? Are you trying to look for to tie up the loop? So that is that when you sort of like proceed with like the fabrication of the project? And the question is like, do you think that's been productive for you, or has it been counterproductive for you?
Well, so I think the idea of the closed loop is, for me, it's one, and to me, it's very much an aesthetic strategy. It's one way in which I try to define something as an artwork. And these are all very kind of like mushy, kind of like undefined kind of categories. But I think because I'm often working with these systems or media that are kind of traditionally outside of art, like energy infrastructure or whatever, I feel like I need to figure out some way of sort of showing that this sits apart from the sort of everyday operations of those things. And to me, something that kind of, the snake that eats its own tail, it's sort of this sort of like, it's a self-contained thing that therefore is sort of like useless in a way. And so that's one way that I sort of conceptualize a work, to be like, this is actually a way of just sort of thinking about and sort of perceiving and kind of evaluating or maybe aesthetically appreciating this thing in itself without just sort of feeding into the sort of like normal operations of that thing. I think that's sort of one strategy, and that's sort of the reasoning why I often kind of turn to that as a strategy. I don't think it's the only one, but it's often been useful when I'm looking at these things that kind of sit kind of outside of sort of aesthetic domains. And then, there's a whole, I think maybe that didn't totally answer your question, but there's a whole kind of then series of technical considerations to sort of make that happen. And so then, it's often figuring out what that is. And it often has to do with sort of what is the sort of system that is sort of the main sort of platform for consideration and work. So if it's something like carbon emissions, and sort of like that's where I'm looking to draw a cycle. Like if it's something about, say, like erasing instead of emissions, and it's sort of those two things are what balance each other out. I've done other works that are more about logistics and about the movement of something from one place and then back to another. So usually I kind of pick one parameter where I'm really concerned with that sort of that kind of process of canceling out a return.
That's, I mean, when you put it out, it's a really cool way of sort of like approaching. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Sure.
Alison, you have a question?
Sure. I
saw your.
It's not very fully formed yet, so I apologize for the probably bad wording. But I guess I'm curious about, as you position yourself kind of outside of these traditional energy models that we use, I guess, how do you, I don't know, come to grips with, or like the energy that you use to make the thing that is outside of, like, I don't know, I guess, like, I mean, things are on your website and stuff like that, and that is, I assume, using energy the way that my website uses the energy. So, like, I don't know, I guess, how do you position yourself outside of these structures that seem so kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
it really isn't very, I have to work on.
I understand. I understand completely. This is something that I think about a lot. And I think for most of my work focused on energy, by kind of trying to use those systems themselves, I'm necessarily inside of them. I'm necessarily like, I'm using those systems as they are. Almost a system as a ready-made is sometimes the way I think about it. So for example, with the hydropower work, that is sort of purposely kind of wasting, in a way, some of that energy. And I think for me, there's always sort of a question of sort of, is this worth it for the artwork? And that's a very kind of personal question, because I mean, what makes it worth it? But in that piece, it felt very kind of borderline to me. And there was, I think the title in some way kind of encapsulates some of my thinking. I sort of think about this vast production of energy, this 100 billion kilowatt hours. And I think for me, the idea of using some like tiny portion of that to create the work felt like it could be valuable. And it actually ties into the last question as well. I think this idea of excess is another way that I think of sort of creating something that's an artwork that sits apart from its normal functioning. So like the idea of borrowing some of the river's energy to kind of create an artificial glacier, it almost just feels purely excessive. Like this is something that can only exist as an artwork, as a way of sort of like thinking about, a way of kind of finally seeing that energy that is typically unseen. And sometimes seeing it actually is much more troubling than not seeing it. So I think there's something about a refrigerator in a subtropical place. It just feels so wasteful. And to me, that's part of what makes it a little troubling to me too. But it's also kind of part of what I was trying to do, is to try to like actually finally let us see this sort of vast production of energy by kind of just borrowing a little part of it and using it to do something that's sort of, completely useless in a way, and completely just about seeing it. And so I think, yeah, very much I'm coming from that place of being like, I'm embedded in these things and enmeshed in them and just trying to make them work to create artworks in a certain way, rather than, I don't feel like I'm in the best position to kind of create completely new platforms. But I think like the work that I kind of presented at the end, the Purple Earth, that's me trying to think, okay, I've done all this work sort of from within. Is there a way that I can start making work that starts to imagine kind of new possibilities? And I think I'm just sort of touching at that and feeling out like what those potentials are. But I think it's a direction that I kind of hope to kind of keep pushing into.
Thank you for the talk and for sharing that struggle, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Hey,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it seems like you've got quite an interesting like research method of like the intersection between like history and science and art. I was just curious about your research practice. Like, how do you go about defining your projects, and where do you look for inspiration? Like, what books are you reading? Where do you? I want to pick your brain.
It's pretty kind of like omnivorous, I guess, and kind of has to be. I think my practice is sort of like necessarily interdisciplinary, and I kind of on some level, it's like I kind of just like don't even care about disciplines. I'm just gonna like take what feels relevant to anything and kind of ignore those boundaries. But at the same time, the reality is I'm often working within kind of art spaces. And so I'm always trying to kind of tie things back into sort of like, what does this mean now sort of like for art and for artists and for that kind of history too? So I'm kind of between the two things. But I think a big part of my practice is thinking about how can I kind of expand the domain of artistic practice and sort of start bringing in all of these other kind of tools or kinds of expertise and things like that, that kind of aren't part of like, painting or sculpture. It's sort of like most sort of narrowly and traditionally understood. And so part of that is through research. It's also through engaging experts in other fields. I feel like I'll often start the research kind of on my own, like trying to read scientific papers and things like that. And then at a certain point, I just need to kind of test it out with someone who really knows. And then I'll try to find the person who's the expert in something and kind of at that point usually have enough of a sense of what I'm trying to do to try to get like kind of a more expert opinion and take on whether it makes sense or not, and sort of whether it holds up. Because I think when I'm sort of borrowing from these other disciplines, it's still important to me to maintain some rigor from those disciplines and not to kind of completely just kind of like willfully kind of invent, even though I think there's always potential for productive misreading and for sort of like kind of bringing other value systems that are maybe at odds with sort of the way things are being used within, you know, a particular kind of discipline, sort of just like kind of like way of working. So I think there's often is that kind of productive kind of like disconnect or mismatch. But it's very much just like reaching out to people, reading different kinds of things. It's super like I do some teaching, and like to be honest, part of that is just to have access to like libraries, because it's so important to like there's so much that's like not just available on the internet actually, or like even like at a public library, and so many databases and things that I just feel like I need to have access to. So I don't know, it's just kind of like it's also very site specific. So often if there's a site for a work, a lot kind of will coalesce around understanding that as a place, and that can be there's usually just kind of so much richness around like an individual location and its history, and kind of just thinking of it also as like the intersection of like many different systems. That can be a place to kind of start to sort and filter through what's going to be relevant to a work, when, you know, it's easy to open up to the whole world, but it's on some level I have to kind of focus to. So site specificity is sort of one way that I do that.
Thank you. And on the back of that, what are you reading at the moment?
Oh, literally right next to me. I've never read Thomas More's Utopia, and so I'm reading that right now. It's very strange.
I'll be quick. I would like you to elaborate I was quickly going through the manifesto, and the sixth one is the most concise one. It's quite fascinating because it kind of condenses the first five in a way, that like the 20th century extolled expenditure, and now we are going to celebrate fluorescence.
Yeah.
So and like there is all that's completely different. Like, so the second question is, because like majority of your work is kind of installation, which is not that participatory, like it is more to acknowledge and more to embrace than to engage with, like in a much more tangible way. So are you working on something similar, or are you willing to make something which is more engaging?
Yeah. So I'll answer the first question. They're a little bit separate, maybe questions. Okay. I think so. Yeah, the last line in the manifesto, I think that's me just trying to kind of summarize this more kind of metabolic reading of the last 100 years of our history in a way. And that sort of, you know, that's not typically how our history is read, but that's sort of the manifesto. It sort of chooses that lens of sort of thinking about energy expenditure versus creation as sort of like a one way of sort of like understanding the history of the many modernisms, and then versus sort of what I'm proposing here. So that's sort of trying to encapsulate that in a way. Yeah, the question of participation, I think that's really interesting. I think very often I see the works as like participating with collaborators more than like the audience per se. So for example, like in Extinct in New York, I had to like work with all the staff of that institution so that they could all become caretakers of the work. And that to me is sort of like, it's kind of like creating these sort of collaborative relationships that kind of reframe what it could mean to be to like work in the space of art. I was actually the first version of that, which was called Extinct in the Wild, was very much based on reimagining the role of the curator and thinking about the curator as a caregiver, and therefore kind of like reframing the curator as someone who cares for artworks as someone now who might care for living things. So there's sort of like a participation is often working in this more kind of behind the scenes way more than it's working with like the audience itself. I feel like with some of the maybe the newer works, like for example, the Purple Earth, like there I'm more explicitly bringing in these sort of co-conspirators, I guess, all the people who are, I kind of invited a bunch of friends to kind of suggest texts for this, and I kind of want to continue that process. So, but again, there it's not participation with the audience, it's kind of participation with sort of yeah, again, kind of like almost like behind the scenes. I don't think I have any projects that like really explicitly engage that kind of participation, actually. I think it might have to do with just like the way that I think of works in general. And I often kind of think about, when I'm conceiving of a work, I often kind of think of kind of two dimensions to the work. And one, which in a weird way might almost feel primary to me, is sort of the work without an audience. And I think somehow I often think of the works as almost, there's almost this sort of fantasy that they're kind of like auto-generative. Like even I think I said like the river kind of creates its own origin. Or maybe like with the drowned world, the idea almost like this forest kind of on its own has sprung up. So there's a bit of that kind of fiction of sort of like removing myself as an author, which, you know, it is a fiction, but I think there's somehow it informs sort of how I envision the works. And in that side of the work, it's almost happening whether I'm there or whether an audience is there or not. I almost want it to feel like it's like a natural process, almost outside of art and outside of the audience. That might also be some reflection in terms of why my work is often not like super participatory in that way.
That I think gives a much deeper insight to me. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi. I was curious, since you also now spoke a little bit about this speculation about the future and how it can actually affect your like not the audience but collaborators in a sense. I'm just curious, do you ever, since you do such an extent research on the projects, do you ever translate this research to something that can, like, you find a new mechanism for something? Do you ever show these people who you work with that something can be done this way? And like, I don't know, with this virus, is this process of like how the virus works, since you did so much research about it, do you come up with ideas how to repurpose it in a new way and, I don't know, something useful? Or like with this biomaterials that you used in the lake, that they can outsource it for something that is actually, yeah, more than just waste in a sense.
Yeah,
I'm just curious if there is like a discussion after the process.
it's often hard for me to know like what is going to be useful to someone else. But there have been a few moments where that's happened, but it's not something that I've seen in advance. Like for example, I don't think I showed this, but one of the sort of systems I used in Extinct in New York was a kind of a system of misters there that were maintaining a particular kind of lichen. And a lichenologist who actually I kind of had worked with in order to understand how best to do this was actually really intrigued by this and said that he had never seen a lichen actually continue to grow in an artificial environment like this before, and so he was going to sort of borrow from some of those techniques and use those in his research. So sometimes I just don't, because I'm not coming as an expert from these areas, it's not always easy for me to know that that's going to be the thing that feels new or different or useful. But that's sort of like the nice part about having an audience, is that they can see things and then kind of like take from it what might be useful to them. With the materials in the kind of biomaterials, those were partly, I was also running a small class alongside of that, where we were creating different kinds of like more experimental bioplastics and things like that. And I think that some of that actually more kind of experimental format of the classroom was a better place to start kind of like pushing the boundaries of some of these things and creating new things that maybe wouldn't have like held up for the duration of exhibition even, but were maybe kind of more interesting as material experiments that kind of took the ideas of the show, but then kind of like took them a little bit farther. That was actually the place where, yeah, I think more kind of experimentation was happening that might kind of lead to something yeah, kind of like unknown and kind of more it's more kind of innovative than the ones that I end up having to use for the exhibition.
Hey Michael, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your speech. It was really enjoyable. I'm just curious about the Extinction in New York project. Now going forward with that like reintegration into the environment, how is that kind of going now? Are you still documenting it, or how are you finding that they are? I know you said like the places that they were previously, maybe now it wouldn't really work. But I'm just curious about like, it's been what, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Is there like an ongoing dialogue or?
I haven't been back for a little while. Last I knew is that some of them were actually one of them I got an update on actually recently. The American chestnut, those were actually still doing well, surprisingly, because they're susceptible to diseases now. They tend not to live beyond 10 years, but you know, it's only been a few. Others I actually don't even know where they are, because I kind of had to like, they were all just going to be integrated into these different plantings, some of the locations of which I never even knew what they were. I've been kind of, you know, I sort of had spare plants that I've been continuing to grow as well. And I've just noticed that some have like managed to kind of hold on and others haven't. I kind of imagine there's something similar happening in New York. I mean, the advantage of the ones in New York is they're kind of under the care of professional gardeners who might be better than me. I'm sure are. But I think, I mean, to me, part of that project is it will necessarily probably be ephemeral. There's a reason why these things are not persisting in the city anymore, and a certain amount of care can kind of generally prolong that, but I don't think indefinitely, because things have to be kind of like continually kind of like regenerating, reseeding, and kind of like finding their way into the landscape in an actually sustainable way to actually kind of persist for a longer period of time. But I still wanted to like at least make the attempt and kind of like figure out the best ways to kind of create the best kind of optimal conditions that you could create within the city, even while kind of recognizing that it's not going to likely be something that's going to be sustainable over the very, very long term.
Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us this afternoon. If there are no other questions, no, okay. I really hope you will come physically here at Fabrica sooner or later. It was very important to have this presentation and talk with you together. Also, the beginning of this path we are doing, which is based on co-ecologies. I think it gave us a lot of points and topics to reflect on, also for the personal research of the artists in residence here. Thank you again. I wanted to invite the public for the next appointment, which will be next week, the 10th of October at 7 p.m. here at Fabrica with Chris Watson. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you, Michael, for being with us.
Yeah,
Thank you, Michael, again.
Thanks for the great questions too. Really nice to meet everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Ciao.
Right, thank you.